So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us for the second share in the series of Bringing the Seder Alive for All Generations. If you haven't seen the first one, you can look at it on Torah anytime with putting in my name, Rabbi Malcolm Herman. So the goal of this is to suggest ideas that are going to enhance your Seder night. Let's first of all start out by reminding us that the goal is to enhance and not to replace. If your Seder night works and it's fine, that's great, then go with it. But often, if you've got different generations around the table, then we struggle to engage everybody, the younger ones, the older ones, the teenagers, those who can't wait for the soup to happen. So we're going to suggest a whole variety of ideas, some stories, some more two-dimensional ideas that can be utilized across the Dorim. I will say that you wouldn't necessarily use all of these, I wouldn't recommend using all of these on one night, because you might not even make it for shul the next morning. But also it's sensible to space these out across the two nights, or even across different years. Let's begin with some ideas for ahead of Seder night, because it's great for the younger children especially to be engaged in the preparation. So for example, to download pictures of Yetzias Mitzrayim, maybe from Torah Tots or from the H website or any other website, and for the children to colour in those pictures and then to turn them into laminated placemats for Seder night. First of all, it builds up their excitement, and secondly, it's a way of them identifying with aspects of the story. Could be on the night itself, they talk a little bit about the picture that they themselves have coloured in and laminated. By the way, one of the key technical important aspects of Seder night is to plan your seating plan ahead of time. And this again will mean that you'll decide who's sitting where, who's getting which picture. Another nice idea which we came across some years ago is for children to make their own Moshe Rabbeinu staff. This, of course, is the original Moshe Rabbeinu staff, going back 3,300 years. It's also half a broomstick, and pictures would have been photocopied from a Haggadah, stuck on, illustrated. There's actually a lot that can be said about the staff of Moshe Rabbeinu. As we know that Moshe Rabbeinu himself did not perform the first three of the Nisim, Damat Avdei Akinim. We'll come back to that because of his appreciation of being saved at the time, but we'll come back to that. But in essence, it's great. It can be brought out at some stage in Seder night, and we can talk about it and some of the Divrei Torah and Midrashim that surround the staff. Quite an easy prop to make. So the key lessons are three. We want to teach our children Emunah, ourselves. The Stam Rebbe calls Seder night the Rosh Hashanah of Emunah. It's the beginning of the year to reinforce our faith, to reinvigorate our Emunah for the whole year. That's one classic lesson, important lesson. Hashgacha Pratis, the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is divinely concerned with every aspect of our lives. And also Hakaras HaTov, recognition of the gifts of Hashem, the blessings of Hashem. So I'm going to suggest different ways in which one can start off a Seder. Different ways to engage. One way which might work for one night, which is for younger children probably 7 years old and upwards, which is a story that not only gets them into the psyche of what happened in Mitzrayim, but is also an important mashal for the future as well. The story goes of a young boy, Mike, we'll call him. By the way, if you're telling the story, pick a child in the story of a similar age to those around the table. Mike is 7 years old. Oh, you're 7 years old. Now, Mike was a lovely boy, and one year for his birthday, his parents bought him something very, very special. Bought him a really wonderful scooter. Everybody was scooting around, even some adults were using scooters, and Mike wanted this scooter. He set his heart on this particular scooter. He was thrilled. First day he's got the scooter from his parents, off he went scooting to the park. I'm going to give you the shortened version, you can elaborate on it. Went scooting around the park, met up with his friends in the park. He was a generous type of boy, so he shared his scooter with others, and they had to go as well. And he went every day of the summer to the park. One day he's in the park, and suddenly a whole lot of boys come into the park as well. And they've also got scooters. But their scooters are the next model up. Their scooters are the super snazzy scooters with extra brakes and lights and all sorts of extra flashy parts to the scooter. And they zip around the park and they zip around Mike, and Mike can't quite help looking at the scooters and thinking, oh, their scooters are even better than my scooter. And the boys whiz around him a couple of times and they look a little bit sneeringly at Mike. Mike thinks to himself, gosh, I wish I had one of those super cool scooters like the super cool boys have got. Anyway, about 5 minutes later, the boys come up to Mike and brake right next to him. Hello, they say. Is that your scooter? Yes, said Mike. It was a birthday present. Not bad, say the boys. Mike feels a little bit awkward about this. And then when the boys said, want to go on one of our scooters? Yes, if you don't mind. That was very nice of them. Mike got this on their scooters, and it's much more aerodynamic, or at least appears to be, and seems to be much more, much faster than his scooter. And he goes whizzing around the park a couple of times, and very nice. The next day he's in the park, and one of the boys comes up to Mike and says, Mike, do you fancy one of our scooters? What do you think Mike would say? Discussion around the table. His parents gave him his scooter, and it was very nice and generous of them, but their scooters, but to be offered a scooter, what, for nothing? Says Mike, you can use it for the moment, it's fine. Treat it as if it's yours. Mike gets on the scooter and goes whizzing around the boys. He's now part of this new gang of boys in the park. And as they go past somebody else who's got a scooter just like Mike's, and the boys sneer at him, Mike doesn't feel 100% comfortable, but he can't help whizzing around and looking at the other scooter. 1 second now, he's got a problem when he goes home. What's he going to do? He can't go home without his scooter. So he says to his new friends, what shall I do? My dad thinks, well, why don't you put your scooter in my shed? We live quite near you. And you can, we're only putting your scooter in our shed and take your scooter home. Then your dad will never know. Mike's not quite comfortable with it, but, doesn't want to upset his dad, wants to be part of the new. And so the story develops. The next day he goes to the park, takes his scooter out of his shed, rides to his friend's house, picks up the new scooter, and goes riding with the friends around the park. Well, a couple of days later, Mike gets in the park first, and the friends come into the park, and they ride straight up to Mike. And they go to Mike, and they say to Mike, Mike, you enjoying the new scooter? Yeah, Mike says, it's great. Have you got the money then? What money, says Mike? You said it was for nothing. I said, from the moment, said Jim, the leader of this group. Not forever, Mike. It's a brand new scooter. How much money have you got at home? Mike's a bit hesitant to say, don't know, about £30 in savings. Oh, well, isn't that funny? Because it only costs £30. Just right. How about tomorrow? But see you then. Poor Mike's a terrible dilemma. On the one hand, what's he going to do now? Tell his father that he swapped his new scooter for an old scooter, not pay the money when he was using the scooter? So he comes back the next day and gives him £10. Nice start, said Jim. £10 to do as a start, but tomorrow we'd like another £10. By the end of the week, Mike has emptied out his whole piggy bank and paid it to these boys, and feeling more and more and more uncomfortable with the group he's finding himself in, especially as he sees that the group is about to offer a new scooter to another boy in the park. Mike says, I'm not sure this is the right thing to do. What's wrong, Mike? Don't you like your scooter? You want to go back to your old scooter, do you? Didn't get you very far, did it? Yeah, but, says Mike. Well, that night, Mike can't sleep, as you can imagine. He's tossing and turning, what should he do? And his dad happens to come into his room and says to him, Mike, are you okay? You didn't eat much of your supper, and it was fish and chips, your favourite. I'm fine, says Mike. You still enjoying the new scooter, says Dad. Mike gasps. Yes, Dad, it's great. It's really nice. Everything okay? And then it all comes out. Mike bursts into tears and tells his father the whole story, and the new scooter and the old scooter, how he feels uncomfortable with these boys as they start intimidating and bullying other boys. And Mike feels really, really, really uncomfortable. And his dad puts his hand around him and says, Mike, why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to upset you because, and to be honest with you, says Mike, the new scooters, the paint's beginning to wear off already. It looks very nice at first, but actually I realised the scooter you gave me is a much, much, much better scooter. Mike and his dad work out a plan. How he's going to go back to the park with Mike and his dad, and he's going to tell them that actually he's going to give the old scooter back, the new scooter back. He doesn't want it. His old scooter is a stronger scooter anyway, and anyway, he doesn't like the way they've been handling other boys. And therefore, Mike decides he's going to go back to his old scooter and find new friends, because his old scooter is the scooter that his parents gave him. Nice story to start Seder night. What's going to do with Seder night? It's the story of the coming down to Egypt. They came down to Egypt and they had the heritage given to them by their father, by Yaakov. And at first it was great. They were very, very proud of it. And then what happened is they settled in Mitzrayim and they realized that everyone else around them was different. And they wanted to be like everybody else. So little by little, they gave up what they had for what looked like new and exciting. Even though actually, ultimately, it was never going to be as good or as valuable as what Yaakov Avinu gave them. And when eventually HaKadosh Baruch Hu steps in and gives them the choice, do you want the new or the old? When you come on board, you're going to bring a Korban Pesach, you're going to sacrifice what they offered you, which was their idol, their Korban Pesach, and then you become part of Klal Yisrael, and you'll receive what was really yours that will last you forever, which is the Torah, the mitzvahs, represented by the new scooter. It's also a good story because, in essence, especially if you've got, it's a story that younger children can listen to, but it's a story that may resonate with those who are older around the table as well. Isn't that the struggle of Jewish identity today? We're struggling to identify what's ours, what's not ours, what's new, what's old, what looks good but isn't good, but what is really part of who we really are. So one way of starting off a seder. I think, by the way, it's very important to communicate, especially to younger children on seder night, that they are the theme. They are at the center point. They're vital. And I've said to my children on seder night, seder night is one of the holiest nights of the whole year. One of the holiest nights of the whole year, a night of Kedusha. Now, maybe Eliyahu Novi will turn up at our seder and redeem us once and for all. Isn't it remarkable how this night revolves around children? Because children are intrinsically Kodesh. Children are intrinsically holy. Children are like diamonds. Here's what I prepared earlier. Children are like diamonds. And even though sometimes, like everybody, we do things wrong, that's just dust on your diamond. But you remain a diamond. You always remain a diamond. And Klal Yisrael are the diamonds in the Kodesh Baruch Hu's world. And even though in Mitzrayim we became totally, we became covered. Our diamond became covered, but Kodesh Baruch Hu could see us. We're going to see through our analysis of the Seder that Kodesh Baruch Hu knew there was a diamond to unearth, a diamond to recover. Let me share with you another way of starting off a Seder, which is more appropriate for older children, but has with it a very profound idea. This is a sheet I prepared. You can prepare your own sheet. It has different logos. Again, as I've said, this may not suit your style of Seder night. That's fine. It's there to enhance if you feel you have those around the table who need to be engaged in a slightly different way. This has various different logos, half a dozen logos or so. You can identify the logos and the emotions that they conjure up. I've actually got 16 over here. It's too many. You can use half a dozen or so. There's this particular logo, which actually, if I was to ask you, what does that represent and what does that identify? So I think most people have difficulty identifying it. The reason is because I made it up. Now, it's so fascinating. We live in a world of logos, and we're so used to logos that we assume the logo itself has meaning. Actually, the logo has no meaning. It's only because we've been previously educated about the meaning of the company that the logo then links us to that meaning. A logo by itself has no meaning. Let's take a dramatic logo, that one over there. By itself, if you gave it to a 5-year-old child, they would have no understanding of it whatsoever. We've been educated for its associations, that triggers meaning. Now at this point, then, if I was using this, I then pick up a matzah. Say, what does this represent? What logo is matzah? What meaning is it supposed to trigger? Discussion around the table. What would you say? Some would say slavery. Some would say freedom. That's curious. Does matzah represent slavery or freedom? At the beginning of the Seder, of course, we say, halach ma'anya. Halach ma'anya, beginning of the Seder. All page references are to the Art Scroll Family Haggadah. Page 24, we hold up the matzah and say, this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in Egypt. It represents slavery. The end of the Seder, Pesach matzah u'maror. End of the Maggid, I should say. Pesach matzah u'maror. Here we go. On page 44, the matzah represents freedom. Now here's an interesting question. Couldn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu, couldn't Hashem have chosen a different logo to represent freedom? You might have a discussion around your table. What would be an appropriate logo to represent freedom within Klal Yisrael? And if it's going to be a food logo, what would be an appropriate food logo? Nice challah, your wife's chicken soup? What would be it to represent? Why is it HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses the same logo for freedom and for slavery? It must be there's something that needs to be retained from the slavery that is necessary for the freedom. Otherwise, the logo would change. Give you an example. I inherited a pen of my father. It's according to Vracha, a fountain pen. When we were kids, the idea of using that fountain pen was the ultimate treat. To be honest, I don't think it was a treat that I ever earned, but the ultimate treat. Today, the pen still represents the relationship with my father, but because my father is no longer alive, the nostalgia that comes with it is completely different. There's an essential core which has remained the same, which is the relationship, but the context of it is completely different. If Hashem chose the same symbol for matzah as freedom and slavery, there's something essential which must remain the same that Hashem wanted us to retain. What is that? And that is, in the words of Rav Hirsch, in brief, that is the idea that matzah teaches us responsibility. It's the bread of responsibility. We were once responsible to slaves, to Pharaoh as slaves. We were responsible to him. And when we came out of Mitzrayim, Hashem said, don't think that you're now responsible to no one but yourselves. No, you are once again avodim. servants of Hashem. I don't want you to lose that sense of responsibility that you had. But now the context is going to change. It's going to be productive responsibility, not destructive responsibility. That is why Hashem wanted to retain the matzah as the symbol, so that we understood that freedom at Pesach is not freedom to do whatever we want to do. It's the opportunity to do what we have to do as avodim of Hashem, as servants of Hashem. Very powerful and important idea. By the way, that's also why Hashem did not allow us to make our own food when we came out of Mitzrayim. I always say that, it's quite a nace. All those wonderful Jewish mothers were there. They were there for such a long time, and when Moshe Rabbeinu said it's time to go, not one of them said, hang on a second, we've been here for 210 years, another 15 minutes to make some smoked salmon bagels is not going to do any harm at all. No, because they understood that when they left Mitzrayim holding the matzah, they left the Mitzrayim, they crossed that threshold, understanding they were now going to have a new master, a master that would give them life and spiritual eternity, rather than a master that was there to destroy them all. So there was no resistance. On the contrary, there was acceptance of the new situation. Okay, let's have a look at some other themes as follows. In the beginning of the Haggadah Holach Manya, page 24, we have the expression invitation. And we say at the end of this, Kol dich v'nyesem yechel, anyone who is hungry, let them come in and eat. Now, we don't make this invitation at any other time for any other Yom Tov. We don't start off in Sukkot, Kol dich v'nyesem yechel, or Shavuos. We don't. Why particularly to Pesach? I'd like to share with you two ideas. One of which comes with a story. First of all, it's very interesting if you notice when it comes to Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Torah gives us two instructions. It says, "Man tizkar," you should remember the day in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu took you out of Mitzrayim. But it also says in Pashas Re'im, Pashas Kiseitze, and elsewhere, "V'zochalta ki eved hayisim b'Mitzrayim," that you were servants in Mitzrayim. The Torah instructs us to remember the fact we were taken out of Mitzrayim in Exodus. Torah also asks us to remember the fact that we were servants in Mitzrayim. What are those two instructions? So, of course, we know we have a daily mitzvah, which is to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is the mitzvah of emunah, the mitzvah of faith. But we also have the mitzvah, the instruction, I should say, the instruction to understand empathy. You were once a servant in Mitzrayim. You were once without, says the Chizkuni in Rei. You were once without. If you have suffered, you ought to be able to relate to the pain and suffering of others, those who have not got a seder night table, those who perhaps have not got the blessings that you might be enjoying. So therefore, there's a dual dimension to our experience in Mitzrayim. There was faith, emunah, which is where we extend ourselves to Hashem. There's also empathy, which is where we extend ourselves to relate to the pain of another. Here at Seder night, it becomes particularly appropriate, as we're about to launch into the whole analysis of Emunah, that we also remember those and invite those in and make those who are sitting around our table comfortable if they perhaps do not have their own Seder night to go to. One reason why it's particularly Seder night is that we focus on that. But I also saw, in the name of the Chavetz Chaim, a very beautiful story, because the Haggadah says, on page 24, we have this invitation, Kol dich v'nyesem yechel, and then we go on to say, Hashat ha'cha, now we are here, Lashon haba b'Yerushalayim, B'Eretz Yisrael, next we should be in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, and we're asking for the redemption. So the Chavetz Chaim explains, by way of a story, that we're going to need to understand the importance of empathy and sympathy for others if we're going to usher in the redemption. And the story tells us as follows, that he once, during the First World War, of course, life was very, very difficult for the Jewish people, and for many people. Many towns and villages were displaced and had to flee as refugees. The Chavetz Chaim encounters a gentleman who, even during the war circumstances, looked well dressed. And he said to him, "How are things for you?" And he said, "Baruch Hashem, my parnos is fine." Chavetz Chaim said, "What do?" He said, "I'm a leather merchant, and I've got the contract to sell leather to the Russian army for their boots." And the Chavetz Chaim says to him, "But that's amazing that you are dealing with a Russian army, notoriously anti-Semitic, and how do you manage when things don't go right?" So the man says, "It's quite simple. It's quite simple. No leather item is completely perfect. Leather is a natural product. There's always a nick or some kind of scratch, but you need to know who to bribe. Now and again, put my hand in my pocket, slip a few rubles, that's fine, the contract continues." By the way, this was a story that is brought in the Art Scroll Haggadah of the Symbolism of the Rosh Yeshiva, volume 3, which has much material that comes from there for tonight. And so the Chavetz Chaim said, "You've taught me a lesson. You've taught me a lesson." So this man said, what lesson am I taught you, Rebbe? He said, I realize now that in order to bring Mashiach, Hashem is going to analyze our actions. None of our actions is perfect. Now and again, it's imperfect. We do a mitzvah, maybe we don't have complete kavanah. But we're going to have to bribe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now we know the Torah says HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not take bribes. The bribe of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that Hashem will look at us, as the Gemara says, the way we will look at others. If we're Ma'aver al Midosov, if we are easy going on others, Hashem will be easy going on us. If we're sympathetic to others, Hashem will be sympathetic to us. Therefore, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to look at our actions, analyze our actions, even if they're not quite perfect, Hashem will say, they're not quite perfect, but this person didn't demand perfection from others, we're easy going on others. And that will be the bribe, as it were, that we offer HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Haggadah brings that over here, when we're asking for redemption, first we need to show that we care for others, we're sympathetic to others, we have kindness to other people. Come in, that's what we're offering. And therefore, then we say, please God, that should usher in redemption. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of important discussion points in Avodim Hayinu. Avodim Hayinu, in this particular Haggadah, on page 26. You may recall from last time's shir that we discussed the expression Biyad chazaka v'zor, the strong hand in the outstretched arm. This time, let's have a look at the expression Lefara Mitzrayim. This is a point that can be raised around your Seder night table to ask for people for reactions. Lefara Mitzrayim. Why does it say Pharaoh Mitzrayim? We know that Pharaoh was the king of Egypt. Egypt was a place where pharaohs ruled. It's tautology. What's the double expression being used over here? So interaction around the table. Some might know what Rashi says. Rashi says that Pharaoh was a melech kosher, a tough king. Mitzrayim was a tough place. We know that Mitzrayim had, the Medrash tells us, Mitzrayim had all sorts of, they used witchcraft to stop people exiting Mitzrayim. If you went towards the gates of Mitzrayim, then there were screams and shouts from all sorts of mysterious figures that would stop you leaving Mitzrayim. It was a place from which no servant had ever escaped. Pharaoh himself was notoriously cruel. Without going into the details of his cruelty, he was a man who was notoriously brutal and cruel. That's one pshat. But I saw in the name of, one second, let's get the name, Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin, that there were two types of subjugation in Mitzrayim. There was the physical and there was the spiritual. The physical and the spiritual. So these two expressions, Paro and Mitzrayim, represent the physical and the spiritual. Mitzrayim, the physical, Paro, the culture of spiritual degeneration in Mitzrayim. Now we understand how the Haggadah goes on to say, had Hashem not taken us out, we would have been bound forever. Notice that Haggadah uses a different expression. First it says we were avodim to Pharaoh. Then it says we were mushubodim. Not we were servants, but we would have been bound. Had God taken us out had God not taken us out miraculously, even had Pharaoh one day let us go, opened the doors, said you can go now. But nonetheless, had we exited that way, we might have become physically free. We would have left under his patronage. We would have left as citizens of Egypt. We would have left with his culture. We would have left with all that spiritual negativity with which we were contaminated in Mitzrayim. So therefore, that's what it's saying over here. That's a double expression, para Mitzrayim, and it explains, had God not taken us out, even had Pharaoh one day let us out, we would have been mushubodim, still tied up with that spiritual culture of Mitzrayim. Okay, now let's look at page 28, where the Haggadah then goes on to tell us the importance of remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim not just on the night, but every single day. And it brings a paragraph, a Mishnah really, which the discussion about mentioning Yetzias Mitzrayim every single day. And of course we say in the Shema, every single day, they have to remember the day we came out of Mitzrayim. That's something we say daily. But of course, saying it daily is not quite enough. It's about living it daily that's really important. And the following story, which I've adapted, again from the Art Scroll Haggadah there, but I've adapted it for what might be suitable for different ages around the table. Imagine a situation whereby, let's say in my case, my wife was to go away for a few days and leave me to hold the fort. It has happened on a couple of occasions. Basically, things were restored by the time she came back. But imagine, now, of course, before she was to go away, there would be a very long and organized list. Directions to the fridge, directions to the oven, don't confuse the two, directions for getting the kids ready for school, all the directions would come with it. So picture the scene where before she goes away, she sits down and gives the whole list to me and to the children, the list of 25 things or 35 things that need to be done every day to keep the household running, all the things that probably I take for granted. And then, as it says to us, I want to read the list every single day. Fine. At this point, I might go around the table and ask, what do you think would be on the list? So everybody from the youngest to the oldest would say, what was on the list? Okay? The youngest might say, bedtime story. Oldest might say, hanging the shirts up, whatever else it would be. She comes back 3 or 4 days later, and the place is in a complete tip. Complete tip. Right? Nobody's had lunch for 2 or 3 days. There's packages all over the place. There's stuff piled up in this thing. The washing machine hasn't been switched to dryer. Nothing. And Mummy comes to the door and says, what's going on over here? And I'd say, listen, we did exactly what you said. We read the list every day. We sat around the supper table and we read the list. We even memorized the list. I can go through it. And Carmen would say to me, but it wasn't just about reading the list. It was about doing the list. Reading it isn't good enough. You've got to do it. So here that God tells us that we've got to recall the coming out of Mitzrayim. But it isn't just about recalling it. It's about living it. It's about understanding what it's all about and incorporating those messages into everyday life. Let's come back for a minute to something I want to share and I just forgot. In Avodah Miyinu, we also say, the more that you praise and talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim, the more praiseworthy that is. Now, a good discussion around the table is as follows. There are many other mitzvot where there's a limitation to it. You've taken your lot of an esrog, you've shaken it in all directions, you've done your mitzvah. You've read your Megillah morning and evening. There's no mitzvah to read it all day long. There's no mitzvah to light Hanukkah candles all night long. You've done your mitzvah, that's it. Why over here is there a specific mitzvah? Keep going, keep going, keep going. Discussion around the table. What's so particular about this? Well, there are 2 answers one can give. One answer is that this is about faith. As the Shlomim Rebbe has a whole shiur on this, then this is about faith, and there's no limits to deepening our faith. But another aspect is that actually this is about appreciation. And there's really no limits to appreciation. Again, a good story. Story which was also attributed to Rabbi Revda. Story attributed to Rabbi Revda. The story is as follows. There's a young boy, and you can adapt this story for the age group, but the particular version of the story was a young boy who post-Holocaust ended up in America. And his uncle took him in. I'll give you the shortened version of the story, but his uncle gave him everything. Gave him education, gave him clothes to wear, gave him a bed to sleep in, gave him Torah studies, maybe music lessons, everything that he had hoped for and dreamed of. And eventually this boy grows up, and he goes to yeshiva, and now it's time for him to get married. And then, at the wedding, beautiful wedding this uncle's made for him. Of course, the first dance of the wedding belongs to his uncle. So he calls his uncle into the center of the circle, is dancing with his uncle, leans over to his uncle and whispers to him, thank you so much. I don't know how to thank you. His uncle stops dancing and looks at him and says to him, that's it? One whisper for 20 years of care? You ought to grab hold of the microphone and announce to the whole hall, not for me, but for you, everything I did for you. I saved your life. I gave you an education. Everything I did for you. One whisper, that's all that is. If you really felt gratitude, it ought to be unstoppable. It ought to be an outpouring of gratitude. That's what God is saying over here. If you really feel gratitude, it should be unstoppable, a constant outpouring of gratitude. Just to explain how we can adapt the story for a younger age group, maybe you tell a story of a king who rescues a little boy. One day he's hunting in the forest, and he sees a little boy sitting on a log. He can describe it. He's riding through the forest. He sees a little boy there who's crying, sitting on a log. The king dismounts, sits next to this boy from his beautiful white stallion. The boy doesn't even know who the king is. The king says to the boy, where do you live? And the boy says, I just live here in the forest. Who are your parents? I don't know. I've always lived in the forest. The king takes the boy, puts him on his horse, rides him to the palace. You can describe it, how the palace is this magnificent eye-opener. And the story then follows a similar sequence. Education comes to the wedding of the little boy, and the boy just whispers this, etc. Is that it? That's all you have to say? It should be an outpouring. By the way, it might be a time and opportunity, perhaps to go back around the table and to reinforce all that across the tov that perhaps children ought to feel for their parents, for all their parents do for them, which is often a forgotten midah. But it's a powerful story. Harizeh Meshubach. And here the pshat is not just Harizeh Meshubach, this is praiseworthy, but one who has this sense of outpouring across the tov, that person is praiseworthy because they really, genuinely recognize that they are dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, dependent on Hashem, and that says a lot about them. Okay, let us now look at a couple of points for the adults around the table. And let us jump to page 30. Page 30 in the Haggadah, which is Midchila. Originally, our ancestors were idol worshippers. In last year's Shir, we gave an extract, I believe, of the various reasons why the Haggadah includes this. And the Gemara in Psachim says that you have to include this. You have to include beginning with the degradation and ending up with the celebration. You've got to move from gunus to shvach, from degradation to celebration. Seems like a strange thing to include in the Haggadah. Can you imagine if you were called up for a prize at school because you worked really, really, really hard, and the head teacher began by listing all the detentions that you'd had. So nice to see you getting a prize today, because I remember when you broke the window in my office when you were 7 years old, and I remember over these last 5 years you've had 14. Wouldn't be very pleasant. Why on earth do you have to mention our degradation? So we spoke previously, the view of the Solomon Rebbe, beautiful idea that part of Seder night is for us to appreciate Hashem's unconditional love for us. If we only began the history with where it all went right, where we demonstrated faith, it wouldn't demonstrate Hashem loves us under all conditions, that we're always a diamond, even when sometimes there's dust on our diamond. It's because of Kodesh Baruch Hu, because we start the story with the dust on the diamond, and we see how we then emerged. For Achshav now, Kavona Makam Lavadoso, Hashem brought us close to Him, we appreciate our intrinsic value. So again, a beautiful message around the Seder night table, because we all make mistakes in life. There are all times when we fail, but Seder night gives us this beautiful idea that even if you failed, maybe you've even drastically failed, nonetheless, you can always come back. And I saw in the Haggadah, the Be'er HaChaim, beautiful taich on this, a creative taich, a creative analysis of this. Midchila, originally. The real translation is originally we were idol worshippers, our ancestors were idol worshippers, and now Hashem brought us close to Him. But he says as follows, Midchila, if we spend too much of our lives dwelling on the past, the times when we went wrong, the things that we didn't do right, then Ovdei Avodah Zarah, that risks detaching us from Hashem, because we give up. We think, well, I can't really be holy, I can't really be spiritual, I can't really be connected. That has a risk, like Avodah Zarah, of taking us away. However, V'achshav, if we focus on the here and now, what can be done, focus on the here and now, then Karavana Makam Avodaso, we will come closer to Hashem. We can't change the past, but we can decide the future. I often say there are two types of people in the world. There's the if-only nicks and the only if. The if-only are the chevra. There's only, if only I would have had different parents. If only I would have spent more time in yeshiva. If only I would have spent more time in other studies, whatever that it is. They're not great company for a sheva rochas. But the if only. And there are others who say, you know what? If I want to make something of my life, it's only if I take charge. Only if I make the most of things. So therefore, this paragraph of the Haggadah is a powerful reminder that actually we're all diamonds, and we can unveil the dust on the diamond if we focus on what we can do in the future. Another thought. On the same page, paragraph down, it says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chishev Esaketz, calculated the end of the Golos. Calculated the end of the Golos. Again, this is more thought at an adult level. Calculated the end. What does that mean? So we know that the Golos was supposed to be designated for 400 years. And we weren't there for 400 years, we were there for 210 years. Different ways of calculating the 400 years, from the birth of Yitzchak, etc., etc. But I saw in the name of Rabbi Malcolm Herman that Chishev Esaketz means as follows. The Gemara in Erechim tells us that, sadly, when we do things wrong in life, then there is a penalty charge. We have to pay for it. But what is the minimum amount of aggravation that constitutes a penalty charge? So the Gemara says, you put your hand into your pocket and you take out one coin, and it's the wrong coin, that's a little bit of aggravation. Even that registers on the scale of penalty charge. The extremes of aggravation, I don't mean the extremes in the painful sense, the extremes in the just mildly irritating sense. So, Mechon Vasman says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu over here, Chishev Esaketz. He was prepared to calculate, acknowledge, even the lesser forms of suffering to be repayment to the debt we had to pay in order to get us out of Mitzrayim earlier. So what we might not have considered to be terrible suffering, Hashem was prepared to consider. Now, even the extreme forms, not extreme in the major sense, extreme in the minor sense. Really, you call that suffering? Wow, that's extremely mild of you to consider that to be suffering. So again, for children perhaps a little bit older, it's almost as though, let's say, you're at school and you're supposed to have a detention. Because the lesson finished 5 minutes late anyway, 5 minutes taken off for detention. if the teacher is feeling benevolent. Here as well, Hashem said, you know what? You didn't have your own land from the birth of Yitzchak. You know what? We'll consider that to be part of the suffering you were supposed to have as well, to accelerate the Exodus. Now, again, page 32. We say, Vayagosh Sham. We're talking about here, there are 4 key sentences in the Haggadah, which the Haggadah then elaborates. The 4 key sentences are how we got down to Mitzrayim, how we suffered in Mitzrayim, how we cried out to Hashem, and Hashem took us out. Let me point out to you a couple of pointers in the time we have remaining. Vayagosh Sham, something that always puzzled me. It says that Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim, but he did not intend to sojourn there. It always puzzled me because it's very, very clear in the Torah that he was supposed to go there. Right, first of all, Avinu was told, your ancestors are going to be strangers in the land. And when he's on his way down to Mitzrayim, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to him to tell him that this is what's supposed to happen. And I want to make sure I say this in the name of the right person. The name of the Netziv. The Netziv. So again, the Haggadah the Rosh Hashivas brings the name of the Netziv to explain as follows. Of course, Yaakov Avinu knew he wasn't going to leave Mitzrayim. That was it. He was going to spend the rest of his days there. But his attitude of mind was one of a sojourner, not one of a resident, one of a stranger. That's what it means. When it says Yaakov Avinu did not go down to sojourn there, it meant his attitude of mind. Now, how do we know this? Now, the Haggadah takes this phrase and brings other textual references to prove the idea. And the textual reference it brings, at first sight, doesn't seem to add much more to what's already been said. Until you look at it a bit more closely. It says, how do we know that Yaakov came to sojourn? Because they said to Pharaoh, we've come to sojourn in the land, we haven't got pasture for our flocks, it's a time of famine. Then it says, please can we dwell in the suburbs of Goshen. Goshen was not in the city. Goshen was not in the center. Here you can see by Yaakov's request, his attitude in mind, please let us remain separate. Let us try and retain our identity. And that's what he's saying over here. He knew he was going to have to stay there. On the other hand, his attitude of mind was he's going to remain a stranger there, a visitor, not a resident. Maybe opportune to discuss around the table how we feel in our own lands of Golos. How do we feel? Is it our home? Is it not our home? Are they just our hosts, or do we belong here? Of course, we know the halacha brings that when you build a new house or you decorate a house from top to bottom, you have to have a zeichel l'churban, one patch of wall as you come through the front door, which is not decorated, to remind us that really we don't belong here. We belong in Eretz Yisrael, in a rebuilt Eretz Yisrael. Here's an idea that you could use different stages of the seder, again for younger children, and that is emoticons. Now, here we have 4 pictures that describe different aspects or depict different aspects of the coming out of Mitzrayim. And next to it, you have emotions. So if perhaps one here and there, the little ones are flagging, you might link this. You know what we're reading about now? We're reading about even the children had to work. They couldn't go to school. They had to do bricklaying. They had to work. What do you think about that? Would you be happy? Would you be sad? If the children are a little bit older, you might go for the more sophisticated version. Both of these can be downloaded from our website, www.c.uk.net. It's a slightly more sophisticated version of this. 4 different emotions. Most of it's straightforward until you come to this one. Here we've got plague of darkness. How did the Egyptians feel? How did the Jewish people feel? How did Klal Yisrael feel when they were coming out of Mitzrayim? Were they happy? Were they sad? Perhaps they were both. Perhaps they were nervous and happy. A chance to explore that collision of emotions. They were happy to leave Mitzrayim, but they were going into a wilderness. They demonstrated faith. They came out of Mitzrayim and they showed faith. Perhaps there was certain anxiety there as well. Some final thoughts before we close, although there's much more that could be said. Let us share with you one more thought on these psukim, page 34. And we cried out to Hashem, God of our forefathers, and Hashem listened to our voice. Notice the change. We cried out to Hashem, not in our own merit, but in the merit of our ancestors. Hashem listens to our voice. So, I saw in the Art Scroll Treasury, I don't remember the original source of this, but a beautiful thought, that we did not think we were worthy of Hashem responding to us. We didn't think we were worthy. But Hashem says to us, of course you're worthy. Remember? Of course you're worthy. You're intrinsically worthy. Vayishma Hashem es kolenu. We cried out in the name of our ancestors, but Hashem responded to our voice, reinforcing the fact that we would be and we could be intrinsically worthy. You might want to give a mashal. Imagine someone calls you up looking for tzedakah or knocks on your door. And the way they make the call is they say, oh, my father, my grandfather, in yeshiva with my uncle. And the balabas says, you know what, you're right, I know all those people. But I also know you, and I know what you're coming for. And I'm only too happy to hear what you have to say. Beautiful thought for all age groups. Chance to reinforce, especially for children, the importance of tefillah. Don't underestimate the importance of tefillah. Tefillah can be life-changing. Daven HaKadosh Baruch Hu with your own voice, in your own way, that can be very powerful. Let's jump now to the plagues, to the makkahs. I just want to share with you, this is a very well-known thought, but it's important to emphasize how it could be dramatized around the Seder night table. And this has been said by Me'am Loeys and others, how each of the plagues represented reminding the Egyptians of an indignity that they had imposed on Klal Yisrael. So each plague was pinpoint bombing, if you like, to remind them of an indignity. And you could go around the table. First of all, this is quite a well-known idea, but you could go around the table and ask each person to explain what the plague, the makkah represented. Let me give you a couple of examples. And here this could certainly be brought alive appropriately for children, appropriately. So the plague of Dam. If you were a soldier in Mitzrayim, and you can just picture the scene, Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron standing by the Nile, and maybe there were thousands of others waiting to see what was going to happen. There had been a warning, although it was a private warning to Pharaoh, but there had been a warning. So I don't know if others were aware yet or not, but people watching, looking around. And then the plague strikes. If you were an Egyptian soldier, what's the first thing you would think of when you saw the whole of the Nile turn to blood? Any suggestions? If you were a soldier and you had taken a Jewish child and thrown them into the river, shed their blood in the river, it's almost like the whole Nile is coming back to remind you of the murderous activity that you were part of. I remember the very first time that I experienced anti-Semitism. As a little boy, about 7 years old, I was on my way to shul, I think for the first time by myself. And I was walking past a house, we were doing some building works, and some kids picked up some stones and just threw stones at me on my way to shul. So when the Kodesh Baruch Hu takes borod and literally throws stones at the Egyptians, isn't that going to remind them of the way that they treated Klal Yisrael? And each of the plagues reminds the Egyptians of an indignity that they caused Klal Yisrael. Let me close with a final thought, which is page 42. We say in the Haggadah, Pesach, matzah, umoror. Pesach, matzah, umoror. You've got to say these three things. You've got to mention Pesach, matzah, umoror. But curiously enough, the sequence is a bit unusual now. We're basically at the end of the story. You would imagine that moror would come at the beginning, not at the end. The bitterness, we're done with the bitterness. Let's move on to Pesach and matzah, which now represent freedom. So I once heard a beautiful thought from a nephew of mine, and he said as follows. He said that sometimes in life we leave bitter moments behind us, but they remain part of our being. They've changed who we are. They remain part of our being. So even though we've left Mitzrayim behind us, don't forget the experience. Remember we've said you have to have empathy with others. If you forget the experience, you won't have empathy with others. But again, I saw a story in the name of the Chofetz Chaim which says differently, that perhaps the bitterness is part of what will bring the redemption. And the story goes as follows. There was a baker in the town who, in times of plenty, it wasn't so easy to sell all his wares. People would prod his dough and it was too doughy or not doughy enough, or too much mon or not enough mon. Not easy to please your customers. The Chofetz Chaim met this baker again during wartime. He said to him, how's business? He said, business is booming. I cannot get the bread and cakes onto my shelves quick enough before it's snatched. There's a shortage of food. As long as I can keep supplying, people are keeping buying. So the Chofetz Chaim, isn't it amazing how during peacetime people were very particular about the standards? During wartime, the standards, there's not such particularity about the standards. So the Chofetz Chaim says, unfortunately, we're not at the madregas of the Rishonim, madrega of the Rishonim, madrega of the Achronim, madrega of previous generations. But we live in a time of godless where it isn't easy to do the right thing. At the same time, whilst Hashem expects us to do our maximum, Hashem does not expect our maximum to seem at the same level as the maximum previous generations. Hashem is more easygoing in what He accepts. We get to shul, we daven with the best kavanah, and we can daven, even if it's not the kavanah of previous generations. We learn with the best concentration that we can, even if we have more distractions previous generations. Hashem accepts that. So maybe maybe the bitterness becomes instrumental in creating the Geula. So the moral is part of what created the Geula. When they came out of Mitzrayim, Hashem said, I'm prepared to accept 2 mitzvahs from you. 2 mitzvahs, Dam Pesach and Dam Milah. Dam Korban Pesach and Dam Milah. I'll accept that. You just undertake those 2 mitzvahs, and we're on our way. We're out. Mitzvah Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in difficult times for Emunah these days, should accept our mitzvahs, the performance of Seder night, and the Emunah that it brings to usher the Geula Shalema, Meir V'Yameinu Amen.